What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and today we are talking about the United States government's debt load. We all know it's grown to a monstrous stack of 30 trillion US dollars. So the question on everybody's mind is, as the debt keeps growing and as the cost of that keeps on growing, because the debt is growing, but also because the interest rate on that debt keeps on growing higher and higher, the question is, how long can they go until they default? How long can they go until they can no longer afford to pay the interest on their debt plus everything else they have to pay for? And that is the answer that we are talking about in this video today, because the answer may surprise you, probably not what you would expect. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, today we are going to be looking at some charts and research put together by Jim Bianco at Bianco Research on Twitter. If you're on Twitter and you're not following him, he's a great follow. Go ahead and give him a follow there for some great research. So the first thing that we're going to look at is obviously the total debt for the United States government has grown quite a bit over the last couple of years. If we take a look at this chart, we can see here just since 2005, which was not that long ago, the US government debt was at under $8 trillion. So in about 17 years here, we have gone from $8 trillion to $30 trillion. In fact, even just 3 years ago, we were only down here at $22 trillion. And he points out that the $22 trillion 3 years ago, since then, that is the fastest increase in total debt on record. Now, throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to be putting this in terms of an individual with credit card debt, because that's how this makes the most sense. This is a person who had maxed out their credit cards with 0% interest, and they were rolling it over to different credit cards every time that 0% ran out. So let's say you got $10,000 on a 0% credit card for a year. You get to the end of that year and you realize, oh, I don't have 0% interest anymore. It's going to start charging me a lot more. Then you do a balance transfer to a new credit card that you just opened up that gives you 0% for another 12 months. And since you got to delay it for another 12 months, you load it up with a little bit more. Maybe your total credit card limit went from $10,000 to $12,000, so you load it up a little bit more. That's what the government had been doing this entire time. They'd been rolling their debt over, and that simply means transferring it from one lender to another. Because when one of their treasuries comes due, when it matures, let's say you buy a treasury, that's you loaning the government money. When you loan them that money, say $1,000, it's going to get paid back to you with interest when it matures. So let's say 10 years. In 10 years, they pay that money back to you. Well, where are they getting that money from? Well, as you can tell, the fact that their debt has been growing here, they're getting that money from other lenders. So they go to somebody else who lends them $1,000 and they get that $1,000 and they pay it to you. And so they're transferring all of their existing debt when it matures to somebody else, and then they are also paying the interest on the increased amount of debt along the way. So you'd expect here, man, that is a lot of debt. Surely it is getting to the point where they can no longer pay the interest on it. And that's where we're going to start getting into the weeds here, because the answer to that is not what we'd expect. This chart shows the average interest rate paid on US government debt. So this is the percent, not the total dollars amount, but we can see when we look at this, the average interest rate paid on the debt over this time frame, so this one goes back to 2000 instead of 2005 like the other one, has been going down, right? Which makes sense, because over that amount of time, interest rates have been going down, right? Pretty much since 1980, interest rates across the board have been on the decline. Been ups and downs, but for the most part, they've trended downwards. So the US government debt has done that as well. Back here in 2000, all of the debt that was expiring, that was maturing, when they got new debt to pay that off, they had a lower interest rate on that new debt than they did from the debt that they got 10 years before that, and 20 years before that. So all the while here, while they're getting more and more debt, they're paying less and less of an interest rate on that debt, to where now in January of this year, their average interest rate on their debt is 1.73%. Now, that is higher than it was a couple of months ago, 6 months ago or so. It's still a lot lower than it has ever been. So the question is, yes, that's a lower percent. 1.73 is a lot lower than where it used to be at like 5%. However, it's a smaller percent of a much larger amount. As we can see here, the interest rate has been going down, but the total debt load has been going up. Now, this is similar to somebody who is looking at what the housing market has done, right? Because you look at the housing market over the last 20 years, prices have gone up and to the right. They've been volatile along the way, but up and to the right. Most people aren't paying cash for that. They're financing it. So U.S. household debt has gone up and to the right. But interest rates, especially for mortgages, have gone down and to the right. They've decreased over time. So the payment on houses has stayed relatively stable, even though the prices of houses have gone up. Same thing here with the total debt load going up. That's like the total house price going up. It's because the interest rate has been going down. It's given them leeway to get more debt because that debt costs less than it did before. So the big question here that he states is, how will the U.S. government afford to pay these debt obligations if interest rates start to go up from here? Because as we can see, interest rates are going up here. And by all accounts, the Federal Reserve and everybody's saying, hey, to deal with inflation, we're going to have to keep on pushing interest rates higher. Now, the interest rate question on how high they'll go because of inflation and the Fed is a different story for a different video. But that's the question here. How high can they go with the government still being solvent? That's where I want to take a look at this chart here, because this chart shows the 12-month sum of interest that the government is paying on its debt at just over $654 billion. But the bottom chart here shows the interest expense as a percentage of GDP. So we're taking a look at these charts. This is since 2008, and we can see here, this is the dollar amount that the United States government is paying, just total, this blue line. So $654 billion. That is the 12-month sum. So in an entire year, as of May this year, they're paying $654 billion a year in interest expenses. So that's like, you're just paying the minimum, basically, if you're just paying close to the interest rate on your credit card balance. That's basically what's going on here, $654 billion. That's just the interest. That's not paying off anything that's maturing. Because anything that matures, they just get new debt. And so we're just looking at the interest here. This bottom chart here is as a percent of GDP. So you can clearly see since 2008, this has been on the decline. Yes, it's been volatile, but as a percent of GDP right now, they're paying about 2.68% of GDP as interest expenses on their debt, whereas back in 2008, it was up at 3%. 2011, it was up at 2.94%. This has trended down as well, which makes sense because as the total interest rate goes down and they roll that over, but the economy still grows, at least nominally through inflation, that would make it easier for the government to pay their debt, despite the fact that the total debt amount has gone up. It's like if you have a credit card, again, we're going back to the credit card example because it makes the most sense. You've got $10,000. You keep on doing a balance transfer to keep that interest rate really low. But at the same time, your income keeps on going up because you get promotions and you get better jobs. And so as your income goes up, then it's a smaller percent of your total income that you have to pay towards that credit card. Meanwhile, they know this, and so they're giving you higher credit card limits. And so you keep on growing that credit card balance that you're rolling over from $10,000 to $12,000 to $14,000. But your income is growing at a faster pace. And so it doesn't matter if your debt is growing, it's still getting easier to pay off percentage-wise compared to how fast your income is growing. That's kind of what we're looking at here. Although GDP is not a direct comparison because GDP, the government doesn't always get the exact same amount from GDP. It depends on what the growth was during a specific year. It depends on employment. It depends on incomes. It depends on inflation. It depends on capital gains. It depends on what the tax rates are during all of that. And so percentage of GDP isn't the perfect number here, but it is an indication. Now, if we take a look at the end of this thread, he says that it's going to be the next few years. It's not months, it's not weeks, but rising interest rates will cause a debt servicing problem in the next few years if rates stay at this level or go higher. And that's because this amount, the $654 billion that they have to pay right now, even if interest rates stay exactly the same right now, that $654 billion will grow, even if interest rates stay the same. Why? Well, number one, because debt is constantly maturing. They've got a lot of debt that they took on when interest rates were back here. They had a lot of 10-year treasuries, 30-year treasuries that are still maturing from 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So as those mature, they have to roll that over into the new interest rate. And so any of that debt that has a lower interest rate than where we're at currently, they have to pay more for that now. The 10-year treasury or the 2-year treasury is at 3% right now, 10-year is close. And so any debt that they have at 2% or lower, they're going to have to pay more for that. And so any of the debt that's down here that's maturing right now, that'll cause that $650 billion amount to grow. The other reason it will grow is because the total debt amount will grow as long as there is any deficit spending. This is the big issue that he didn't go into that I'm going to show you a new chart here. So this chart is the annual federal surplus or deficit. And so you can see here this black line is 0. So anytime the blue line rises above the black line, there is a surplus. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a little bit of a surplus there, and we've been at a deficit, a deep deficit ever since. That simply means the government is spending more than they're making. And so the government can get income from 3 sources, really 2 sources, but we'll say why it's 3 in a minute. Number 1, taxes, right? They take money out of your paycheck. That's a transfer. Money comes from one area, taxes, your paycheck. Then they spend it into another area, paychecks, corporate welfare, social welfare, military spending, healthcare spending. Wherever the government spends money, this is called a transfer payment. So taxes are non-inflationary, potentially deflationary because of the wealth destruction effects that take place, depending on how it's spent, which most of the time is going to have that result. So you have a transfer payment from one person to another. That's from taxes. So that's the first place that government income comes from. The second place that government income comes from is borrowing, debt, right? You loan $1,000 to the government in the form of buying a treasury. Banks do this all day long. Financial institutions do this all day long. Large corporations that have large cash positions do this all day long. This is all money that's loaned to the government in the form of buying treasuries. This is money that's lent to the government. Again, this is a transfer payment because if you loan $1,000 to the government, you can't go spend that $1,000 right now. So that $1,000 that's with the government, they're going to go spend that somewhere. And then let's say in 10 years, they're going to pay that back to you. So then that transfer is returned. So borrowing out of the economy is still non-inflationary because it's a transfer from you to somebody else, wherever the government spends the money. And then the last place that they can get money from is the Federal Reserve. So if they try and tax you more and there's not enough to be taxed out because of the recession or whatever, if they try and borrow more, but interest rates start spiking because nobody wants to lend at the current interest rates, it's just not lucrative enough because they need their money more, then they borrow, but the lender isn't a person, the lender is the Federal Reserve. Now they have to do this through a couple of steps, but the end result is the reason why the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has grown so much over the last couple of years is because they print money into existence and lend it to the U.S. government. So they've printed about $9 trillion worth, and a lot of that they've lent to the U.S. government. And that is where this deficit has come from. They've basically spent trillions of dollars more than they've been able to get from taxes. So they've had to borrow the difference. And a lot of that has come from printing. A lot of that has come from the Federal Reserve. So this is the question. How deep will deficits stay? Because if deficits stay this deep at $2 trillion, $3 trillion every single year or get deeper, then the question of when will this become an issue? When will that $654 billion in interest turn into $1 trillion in interest, $2 trillion in interest? It gets there pretty quickly. However, if this deficit goes back up to more normal levels, and when I say normal, I mean like historically normal, not normal as in good, at like $1 trillion, then it's going to take a lot longer. The amount that they're spending is not significantly higher than the amount that they're bringing in from taxes. And so the amount that they have to borrow and increase the national debt by this $30 trillion, where we're at right now, this starts to grow at a slower pace. And the slower this grows, the better for their budget, because as they have to grow that, they're getting debt at higher and higher and higher interest rates. The question is, how long will it last? Nobody knows, because it all depends on this, the deficit. We know what interest rates are at. We don't know where they're going to be, but we can have a fairly certain idea based on what the Federal Reserve is saying right now. And then we don't know what the deficit is going to be. We don't know what elections will be like. We don't know who's going to be in power, what kind of spending they're going to want to do. So if we get a ton of spending and the national debt keeps on growing, well, then we get to that end game a lot faster. And at the end of the day, if we get to the point where the federal government, let's say they were looking at this number and it goes, their interest expenses are not at $650 billion anymore. Let's say they're at $1 trillion, $2 trillion, and they can't afford them. They try and tax, they can't get that much, and they can't cover their expenses. They can't pay off their old debt. At the end of the day, this is what's going to happen. The Federal Reserve will take their balance sheet from $9 trillion to 10 trillion, 12 trillion, 20 trillion, whatever it needs to be. They will be the ones to loan the government that money. And it doesn't matter how much debt the government has if it's held by the Federal Reserve here. Why is that? Because the Federal Reserve, after they pay for their own expenses, they sweep all the profits back to the government. It's like the government pays them $1 trillion in interest and they get $999 billion back. And so any debt that the Federal Reserve owns from the federal government is basically interest-free debt for the government. That means that if tomorrow the rest of the world were to sell all treasuries and the Federal Reserve bought all those treasuries from the rest of the world, now the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is $30 trillion. They own all the debt. Now, instead of the government paying $654 billion every single year in interest, that number goes down to zero. Because yes, they pay the $650 billion, but it comes right back then. And so their total cost of servicing that debt is basically zero. So the larger the balance sheet gets for the Federal Reserve, the easier it is for the federal government to spend money and spend more money. But right now, as the Federal Reserve sells assets off its balance sheet, that will drive interest rates higher. That will drive the percent of GDP that the government pays in terms of their interest higher. It will drive the amount, the total dollar amount higher. And this is the kicker, it will drive income down. Because the more of a recession we have, the more tighter monetary conditions we have, the more people are saving, the less people are spending, more people get unemployed, get laid off, less inflation, we get deflation, we get collapses, debt defaults. All those things contribute to less income for the government. So at the end of the day, it still is only a matter of guessing as to how long this game can go on. But we all know that if it gets to the point where things get too tight and the government is close to defaulting, the Federal Reserve will step in and print the difference. Hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions in the comment section below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.